Hello, I'm Miranda Montrone. I'm a psychologist and family therapist, and I work in private practice in Sydney, Australia. I have about 35 years of experience working in infertility and assisted reproduction. In the late 1990s, when altruistic surrogacy started being done in Australia, I was referred into people for pre-surrogacy implications and assessment counselling. Over time, I realised I was getting very interesting information that, as far as I knew, hadn't been published. So from 2002, I asked my clients for consent to use their non-identifying information in future surrogacy research. So the future's now. This paper here is the summary of 15 years of my client seeing them, 160 surrogacy cases, including intended mothers, intended fathers, surrogates and their partners, totaling 602 individuals. We have done the socio-demographic and psychological analysis of the information, and we believe it's some very interesting paper. The breadth and depth is very good. Main findings. The surrogacy was mostly gestational, with the embryos used being those of the intended parents. The reason for the surrogacy was primarily intended mothers' health complaints, which is unsurprising. However, from when same-sex male couples started being treated, they became 20% of the sample. Interestingly, the relationship between the parties, surrogates were mostly close family or friends or extended family networks, with only a small percentage sourced through online surrogacy forums. Socio-demographic, there were some interesting differences there. Intended mothers were more likely to live in a higher socioeconomic area, have tertiary qualifications and were professionally employed, and they were younger. However, surrogates were also living in a relatively high socioeconomic area, were employed, had formal education, and they were older. And there was no indications of significant financial disadvantage. We believe there's a relative socio-demographic equivalence between the parties in these surrogacy arrangements. Psychological. The personality assessment inventory was completed by 98% of the people, and overall there was no findings of significant psychopathology in any of the groups. The mean norms for each group were around the PAI clinical norms, and there was only one elevation that was noticeable, and that's the intended mother's somatic concern scale, with the health complaints subscale being elevated, understandably again. There was also an elevation for the women, both groups of women, in the PAI warmth scale, which would be protective in surrogacy. And whilst there were individual elevations which were addressed in the clinical context, as I said, no significant psychopathology, which is very reassuring. These findings are particularly interesting because of the large sample and the number of cases, and very importantly that all of these people were seen, all the parties to the surrogacy, not just individual groups. And particularly the males, there's not, as far as we know, there's no information for males in this sort of way published already. So we think it'll be very interesting for people who are doing pre-surrogacy work, and reassuring for people doing altruistic surrogacy in Australia, that there's no significant concerns that are indicated by this large research here. For future research, we are planning to do a qualitative analysis of the values and attitudes of these people with regard to surrogacy, which we've already found a bit interesting to look at. I'm also interested in looking at post-surrogacy birth counselling for the surrogates and their partners, which is a requirement here. This is a paper that we think contributes to the body of research data on surrogacy. We would find it very interesting if there were similar sorts of studies done in a compensated regime like in the United States, or in another altruistic surrogacy place like the United Kingdom. It would be interesting to see if the findings were similar or significantly different. This paper would definitely not have been done without my co-authors. I work in clinical practice, I'm not a researcher. This has been a very steep learning curve. Professor Kerry Sherman is a long-term collaborator. She's from Macquarie University here in Sydney. Dr. Jodie Avery from Adelaide she's the one that suggested that we use the socio-demographic marker of the postcode, which has been very helpful. And Dr. Yolanda Rodino has been the research rock that has helped me through this. She is from Perth, and she's a long-term colleague and friend, and she helped on every section of the whole paper. Lastly, but not leastly, I would like to thank the individuals, the 602 individuals that trusted me to help them along their surrogacy journey and to treat their information with respect. And it's added together to produce, we think, a very interesting paper. We hope that you find it interesting.